If Riviera: The Promised Land was the game that started the Dept Heaven series, then Yggdra Union was the one that gave it any chance of becoming a franchise. It's the first game in the franchise to really embody everything that makes the Dept Heaven franchise unique. It has gameplay that I honestly haven't seen done in any game aside from Yggdra Union. It has a banging soundtrack that blows Riveria's out of the water, and it also has a unique designation of being one of the hardest games to ever come out on the Game Boy Advance. There is a reason why out of all the games in the Dept Heaven franchise, Yggdra Union is the only one to receive a number of spin-offs in the form of Blaze Union, a Japanese-only prequel, Yggdra Unison, a mobile fan-disc game which I didn't play, and Gloria Union, which borrows the same mechanics but in an entirely different setting. More importantly than any of that, however, is the plain fact that Yggdra Union is a really well-made tactics game. It isn't afraid to throw the player into the dirt and expect them to figure out how it all works, or potentially wind up in a dead-end situation which might be impossible to recover from. If secrets were something that you really enjoyed in Riviera, then Yggdra Union has way more of them, and ones with much more important rewards that the players desperately desire because they really do need every bit of help they can possibly get. To top it all off, the story is also leagues ahead of the previous one as well, detailing a serious war drama that clashes really well with the cute SD art style all the characters have. It tells a surprisingly nuanced war story where Yggdra and Millenor fight back against the Empire, but unfortunately stakes are high on either side, and the war is a far dirtier affair than just a simple good versus bad. Justice lies with the Holy Sword, but does it truly? Yggdra Union came out in 2006 on the Game Boy Advance. It then got a PSP remake only 2 years later in 2008, which is what we will be focusing on today. A Switch release of all things came out in 2020, but that's Japanese only, and honestly from what I can tell, is pretty much a port of the PSP version. News of the Switch release was probably what prompted me to start this whole retrospective in the first place, as it reminded me of this franchise that I never got around to finishing until somewhat recently. If we're talking about English versions, the PSP version of Yggdra Union is easily the best version with one minor caveat. Just like with Riviera, the PSP version has smoother graphics, a much cleaner soundtrack, which is great since the music is ridiculously good, voice acting for every character, and even a whole nother ending and chapter to experience, alongside a bunch of other additions strewn throughout the game like more characters, cards, side chapters. The only real big downside to playing the PSP version is that the game's difficulty has been toned down quite a bit. There is a hard mode which is basically the same difficulty as the original Game Boy Advance game, but you can't access it without having beaten the game already, which I'm never really a fan of. Difficulty should exist for the sake of giving the player a tailored experience that really maximizes the amount of fun the player can get from their playthrough, whether that be through challenging them or getting them to see more of the story. So what's the point of withholding this option from the player? Sure, maybe if it's a ridiculous one-hit challenge mode that's meant more as a sick joke than anything. Otherwise, it might as well be available from the beginning. Especially since when it comes to more obscure remakes like this, a good portion of your player base is gonna be returnees who are playing the game in order to see what's new, while experiencing a game they already loved. To add insult to injury, the new hidden ending, added exclusively for the PSP remake of Yggdra Union, is only available in hard mode, which itself is only available after having beaten the game once. As I am coming from the Game Boy Advance version, I just found an already completed save file online, so I could just go straight into it. While I do think the game's original difficulty was pretty balanced, I do recommend trying it out on hard first, and if you think it's too difficult, go ahead and restart on normal. The only big things you'll miss is one character you'll probably never use, and the extra ending, which is just one more chapter added at the end of the game. As mentioned earlier, Yggdra Union follows the harrowing tale of the eponymous heroine Yggdra, the Princess of Phantasynia, who starts off the story by fleeing away from her home, which has been completely destroyed by the Empire led by Emperor Gokasa. Her choice in hiding from the pursuing soldiers in a bandit hideout ends up with the bandit leader, Silver Wolf Millenor, coming into confrontation with the Empire's pursuit force led by Aegina. After driving them away, Yggdra and Millenor meet, and thus begins a deal between the two that will lead to the revival of the royal army and a crusade to take down Emperor Gokasa and revive Phantasynia. If there's one thing about Yggdra Union's story that is surprising, it's how it treats the subject of war between nations with a more nuanced look than good guys beating up the evil big bad empire. Considering that the basic standard is like Fire Emblem 7, where all the bad guys are super ugly people who relish in pillaging villages, it's nice to see them try and show a more human side to the empire. Yggdra Union dives into the idea that the main characters aren't necessarily the good guys, even if they are on the losing side. I really do like how this theme is presented from the beginning of the game all the way till the end, even if it is a little in your face at certain points. It does a great job of twisting the idea of justice and what it means for both sides. While you don't learn a great deal about the dragon generals that make up Gokasa's main army, you do understand their faith in Emperor Gokasa stretches beyond that of a simple vassal. For them, Emperor Gokasa is basically the same as Yggdra and Millenor, and just like how this war acts as a life and death situation for Fantasynia, they too have equally high stakes for the Bronchian Empire. As Yggdra and Millenor force their way through the Empire, the people who stand their way aren't necessarily ruthless murderers, but rather others who are forced into the fight because of their own circumstances, all of whom are nonetheless cut down in order for the royal army to remain victorious. While you do get a decently sized cast to join your party, the main characters for Yggdra Union are clearly the eponymous Yggdra, Princess of Fantasynia, and the one with the highest stake in this war, and Millenor the Silver Wolf, a bandit leader who's initially in it just for the rewards, but ends up becoming the second in command for the royal army. Both of these protagonists do an amazing job of balancing each other out. Yggdra as a naive but hopeful princess who fights for what she believes in, and Millenor the realist mood maker who keeps the army together, and more importantly, acts as the voice of reason in guiding Yggdra's decisions. Millenor is the one that backs Yggdra on all her choices when she's constantly worried about whether she should or shouldn't, and is also the one to bring the army back from the brink when they are at their worst. They play really well off of each other, with Yggdra as the main one to grow from the beginning as a naive princess, towards the end of the game as a capable leader, and Millenor as her guiding light up until she can come into her own. This is also reflected even gameplay-wise, where Millenor is stronger than Yggdra in the beginning, but Yggdra, if trained properly, will eventually outstrip him by the end. Millenor is also kind of like a Mega Chad, so even without Yggdra, he's pretty dang likable. He just isn't solo main character material since he doesn't grow nearly as much as Yggdra does throughout this journey. Somehow, I managed to make it this far without talking about the gameplay, which is funny because gameplay is definitely what Yggdra Union excels at first and foremost. It is one of the most unique strategy games I've had the pleasure of playing, with a difficulty that I think is tough, but pretty dang fair at the same time. In the Riviera video, I said Riviera was a game about resource management. Well, Yggdra Union takes that concept and turns it up to 11. While you still have the standard enemy turn and your turn tactics system, just about everything else is different. I'd go as far as to say that it might be a little too overwhelming for most players upon starting the game, but for those willing to stick with it lies a fun and challenging experience up until the end. The base concept of Yggdra Union is a turn-based strategy RPG. What separates it from all the others, however, is two things. One is the card system, where essentially every battle you select a number of cards which serve both as your movement options as well as your attack options. The second is that while you can move your characters as much as you want depending entirely on the movement value of each card, both you and the enemy can only attack once per turn, with additional attacks depending on the positioning of both yourself and the enemy's position. Basically, one battle per turn with how many people participating in that one battle, depending entirely on how the player sets up the board. You stack all of this together with a ton of conditionals like how certain units are overwhelmingly stronger in certain areas, weaker in others, a weapon triangle, trying to predict how the enemy will engage your units on their turn, and you have a strategy game that really makes you think every turn out. Even battles themselves aren't just a numbers game, but rather, you're given control whether to go passive or aggressive, with passive allowing you to build up charge until you can unleash your superpowers, and aggressive doing more damage and applying an element effect on your weapon. Making decisive use of this simple charge system is usually what spells the difference between victory and defeat. Stages themselves are limited not just by the increased MVP permanent stat bonus if you beat the stage fast enough, but also by the amount of cards you can bring to battle, as once you run out of cards, you instantly game over as you can't move anymore, and also by the fact that all characters have HP, or morale as it's called. The fun thing about morale in Yggdra Union is the fact that it does not recover between stages, so everyone takes permanent damage every battle, with the only way to recover it by sacrificing items for morale recovery, items which all have their own special uses or powerful buffs, and aren't that easy to find, especially for first-time players. The biggest difference between the GBA difficulty and the PSP normal difficulty is the fact that the PSP normal mode makes this part way easier, as characters gain 25% of their max morale upon leveling up. So you don't have to struggle quite as much in trying to constantly sacrifice items for your army. While characters can't die technically, only if Yggdra or Millinor ever run out of morale is it an instant game over, the penalty of other characters losing all their EXP and coming back with 1 morale is incredibly bad still, and will force you to spend a ton of items bringing them back up to full. There are just a ton of options in what you bring to every battlefield, and how you decide to tackle it. Even what specific cards the player brings to every battle is entirely up to them. You can't just bring all the high movement cards because you still want to use the cards with the best super effects, but you also can't just bring your strongest cards since you need movement to actually move your army. While units have their own level ups that affect their stats, cards themselves also power up with every battle they are used in, so you have to try and level the weaker cards that might become more useful later. To top all of this off is the fact that every item in Yggdra Union has a durability limit of sorts, where they can be equipped on a character for a certain amount of battles before they disappear forever. These items can grant anything from basic stat buffs to special effects such as complete nullification to ice attacks, which makes that character pretty much immune to an army of Undines by themselves. What I think is super interesting, however, is the fact that you can't overwrite any of these equipments. So if an item, say, is there for 4 battles, once you put it on that character, it's stuck on that character until 4 stages are over. I know me just saying this probably scares everyone to never using any of their items in fear that they will use them incorrectly or they will equip something and be stuck with it for far too long, but I think that's kind of the magic of Yggdra Union. There is a cost and reward to nearly every facet of the game, whether that be through morale loss, card EXP, character EXP, item gains, equipping items, and so forth. Players can minimize the downsides and maximize the upsides by understanding different systems and capitalizing on them. It's a game that goes, yeah, Yggdra Union is hard. You have all these items that you fought tooth and nail to collect, whether through secrets, stealing, or most likely both, so you better dang well use them. Speaking of which, you know how Riviera has a bunch of little secrets which are fun to discover? Well, Yggdra Union has way more of that, all of which are made more enticing by the fact that all of them are useful. Even if the inbuilt effect of the equipment isn't the greatest, it can still be used as morale for your army that is constantly in dire need of it. Characters are all pretty useful in Yggdra Union for the most part. I won't say they are balanced, but they all have their own specific specialties and roles, especially considering the fact that many of the skills in the game can only be used by characters wielding a specific weapon type. The only ones I'll particularly shout out are Yggdra, of course, since she's the main character and needs training early on to really shine later in the game, Millinor, since he's the other main character and is equally as important, and finally there's also Misso the Tactician, who's a new addition for the PSP version, and comes with the absolute BS weapon called the Scythe. You know how I know the Scythe is one of the greatest weapons in the game? Because that's Gokasa's main weapon, and that man is absolutely bonkers broken. One of the greatest parts of Yggdra Union is the fact that the stages and overall difficulty of the game are crafted expertly in order to make the players engage with their systems. If a player doesn't make use of effects such as bridge buffs to knights, or how Yggdra starts with an item that grants her counter for a few stages, chances are they're probably gonna have trouble finishing the game. Granted, I think Yggdra Union's difficulty comes less from a place of the game itself being really hard, but rather the fact that there are several factors which the game expects the player to take full advantage of. And if they don't, then yeah, battles can seem kind of ridiculous. The game does a pretty good job of explaining everything as well, something which the next game in the Dept series doesn't do nearly as well. Finally, I think Yggdra Union's presentation is probably the biggest upgrade from Riviera, and I mean that in pretty much every department. Yggdra Union is a game that, even in present times, I think still looks great. The actual battles of the game feel incredibly fun to play through and watch, from the beginning, when you watch your army jump onto the opposing army, to the actual back and forth as you try to choose between going aggressive and passive. The big sprites do a great job of letting the players get a good look at them, and they also serve a practical purpose in helping players gauge roughly how much HP both armies have left. By not being able to see exactly but only roughly how much HP each army has, it allows for quite a bit of skill expression as players eventually start to figure out how battles will go just from looking at the stats, weapon type, element, environment, and a whole bunch of other things. Music is absolutely baller as well. It probably helps that somehow every single character in the game has their own unique battle theme, and they're all pretty dang decent. Major shoutouts to both of the main character themes especially. The voice work is also better than Riviera's, which isn't saying much considering how I felt about that one, but yeah, Milanor and Yggdra both sound great. While I listened to both the Japanese and English voice acting, I stuck with the Japanese for most of the way, and I thought they did a perfectly decent job, considering especially just how much the main characters talk throughout the game. Yggdra Union is a game about cost. From a story perspective, it asks the question of what exactly is justice, and how much is this war between Fantasynia and the Empire going to cost for both sides. From a gameplay perspective, every single moment in the game is a constant battle of resources, where the player's resources will constantly dwindle with every fight, with the main goal for the player being to try and minimize these costs while maximizing the rewards. It's a game with a ton of depth, and one that expects the player to figure all the stuff out and use it to their advantage in order to reach the end. It's a game that rewards careful planning and thinking on every turn. While yes, there are some hidden items which are kind of complete nonsense to find, there are also plenty of secrets that the game does give ample hints towards, and even without some of the best items out there, the game is still perfectly beatable from beginning to end. It tells a surprisingly nuanced war story that you wouldn't expect from such a game, especially one with such a cute SD art style. I haven't gotten around to tackling Blaze Union, but if anyone's interested in hearing about that game, I might talk about it after I beat it and after I go through the last two games in the Dept series. We've only got 2 more to go through, and the next one is a banger. Some might even consider it to be a better game than Yggdra Union. As for my opinions on it, all I will say is that if you thought that Yggdra Union was a little obtuse and complicated, you ain't seen nothing yet. All the supporter stuff is in the same place as always, like, subscribe, notifications. If you want to talk about your experiences with Yggdra Union, feel free to do so down in the comment section below. I know chances are if there's any game people have played from this franchise, it's probably this one. That'll be all for now. I'll see you later. Till next time.